I'm Tim Flakoll. I'm Provost for Tri-College University, which is a partnership between NDSU, Concordia, MSUM, M-State, and North Dakota State College of Science, and I'm also Director of Operations for NDSU Downtown. I'm here today in my role as an advisory board member of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, who is the sponsor for today's event. The Institute's mission is to promote democratic participation in social and ethical issues affecting the Northern Plains and beyond. The Institute fulfills its challenge by engaging citizens in various discussions, focusing on what kind of society we want to live in and how we're going to create it. Just as a reminder, I know it'll be you could have to miss out on your highly anticipated calls from the car warranty folks, your social security number, and your student loan, but if you can please silence your phones, that would be appreciated by everyone. Today's like last month, we're using the 30-30 rule. Anyone who wants to make a comment or a question is limited to either 30 words or 30 seconds to do so. So we just really don't want somebody to filibuster, so we can make sure everybody gets the opportunity to have their question answered as well as possible, and I'm sure they'll stay around afterwards in case there's something else. Then we'll let everybody go through one time, and then we will also later on open it up to the folks that are joining us remotely. The slides for today's presentation will be available on the Northern Plains Ethics Institute website. I would also ask you to please mark your calendar for next month, when our topic will cover NDSU marketing. That is March 25th, right here, same building, same time, 12 o'clock noon, and it will provide an overview of the marketing research and approaches employed to get the desired actions. So let's get into today's topic. Today's presentation is titled Meeting NDSU's Enrollment Challenges. And serving on regional and national boards, I can tell you this is not unique to NDSU. This is not unique to North Dakota. And this is widespread across the United States. All campuses are challenged similarly. It's a part of a multi-series hosted by the Northern Plains Ethics Institute. And in the information across the country, fewer and fewer traditional age high school graduates are choosing to attend colleges and universities, and in the coming years there's a predicted decline in the number of high school graduates. This confluence of challenges impacts campuses across the United States, and this presentation will discuss this phenomenon and how NDSU is working to meet that challenge and tackling that problem. Today's presenters are NDSU Chief of Staff Chris Wilson and Laura Oster-Aaland, Vice President of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management. Again, our thanks for being actively engaged in your campus community. And with that, please welcome Laura and Chris.
Hi, everybody. Dark Light's my friend today because just a couple of days before having an open forum campus-wide, I came down with an eye infection. So I kind of look like an extra from a zombie movie right now, but the dark lights are kind of helping a little bit, so hopefully you guys can't see. I apologize if it's a little distracting. You're probably wondering kind of, well, here, I want to make sure, like, why am I involved as Chief of Staff? Back in 2018, we're going to give you a lot of information today, but just a quick background. In 2018, when the summer of 2018, when we had the first kind of became aware of that first big enrollment drop, we were also going through a transition time period in the provost office, and responsibility for admission had been in the provost office. But because we had a new provost coming in, an interim provost, we'd shifted over responsibility for admission, undergraduate admission, to the president's office directly, so that the new provost wouldn't have that portfolio, wouldn't have to learn that, because it was obvious that it was something pretty critical was going on there. We got together, the president got together a working group, a task force of kind of key people to try and understand what was going on. Because it was involved, it was kind of interdivisional. There was people from the provost office in admission, and people from finance, and people from institutional relations. We needed kind of somebody from the president's office to kind of coordinate that all, and so that was my role, trying to coordinate this task force and get all the groups we were all, just to make sure we're all working well together and playing well together and figuring out what the NDSU's answers to this issue was going to be. Kind of the four key players right now, for me. Then there's Laura Oster-Aaland, who will be speaking next, but I also want to throw out Meredith Sherwin, who's Director of Admission, the stuff for admission, just day to day, that's what she lives with, that's her primary responsibility. And then Alicia Kaufman, just earlier this year, we switched over, I guess it's last year now, responsibility for international admissions from the admissions office and put it into the international programs office. And we've just transferred that office to also a presidential report so that we have better coordination between our international admissions office and our regular admission office so that we're all seamlessly working together. So it's worked pretty well so far. We'll get more into it, but I just want to make sure it's not just Laura. There's a whole, and besides those 4 people, there's tons of people that are critical. They're doing a lot of great work on this stuff in very tight, difficult circumstances, as we'll go through. What do we hear about? Why did we do this presentation 3-4 years ago? Why are we doing it now? That drop off right there. So you can see, pretty steady, increasing, steady numbers, all above the 14 mark for years and years. And then we have this drop off starting in 18 and then going into 19 about our overall enrollment numbers. And obviously that, those not just students, that also has financial implications, has a lot of implications for the institution. So this is where the president created the working group, and we've been working on this nonstop since then. As we dived into this, it became very, very clear that NDSU was not alone. In fact, NDSU was kind of late to the game because what was going on across the country had hit the rest of the country sooner than it hit NDSU. This is a slide that shows the number of college students in the country from 2011 to 2019. I draw your attention, you can all see the trend line. That's not a good line. But draw your attention up to right there. There are 2.3 million fewer students enrolled in college in 2019 than there were in 2011. That's a lot of students that aren't in college anymore. So what the rest of the country was fighting this battle for a long time because this big long downward trend, we just picked it up right here. And we picked it up for the last couple of years. So we have to figure out kind of what's going on here now and how do we fight it. But it's abundantly clear that it is not just us. If you read any of the local media, if you read the Chronicle, you see a lot of stories. All the headlines I'm going to show to you are just from the last few weeks, or maybe, I think the oldest one that I show you is from November. But this is Dickinson State, part of the North Dakota University system. The elimination of 14 positions, 6 programs. I think they've modified that slightly recently, but I think they're trying to put programs together. But at the end of the day, the money's not there. The money's not there, so something else has to be cut. So there's Dickinson State on one end of the state. This is from the folks in Kansas. This is just a few weeks old. Fewer Kansans are going to K-State. Don't expect that to change soon. In reading this article, it was interesting because the things they tried, the things they've done, their analysis, it literally, you could have taken out the word K-State and put NDSU in there. We're going through almost the same exact steps that they were going through. This was just from a few weeks ago. 5 Minnesota colleges to merge as enrollment keeps falling statewide. This is from Minnesota Public Radio. Fewer students are going to college. Here's why that matters. This is from Iowa. Not too long ago, enrollment drops across Iowa's public universities. This is from Montana. This is from November. Enrollment declines steeper than UN reported. Budget cuts coming.
Chris?
Yeah.
When you turn your head, we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll try and. There we go. Another one from the University of Montana. This is just from a week ago or two. Shows their enrollment dropped yet again. So there is a lot of pain being suffered all across the country and all across this region. We're not alone in it. That doesn't mean we get to, I mean, misery loves company, but we also have to figure our own individual way out of this situation. Oh, sorry, here's one more from South Dakota. You know, these headlines look familiar because it's the very same things that NDSU is dealing with. You know, we had a $5.5 million budget cut this year as a result of the down enrollment. So we're all trying to figure this out. In looking at this, in my mind, there's three different things. There's lots of different things that are impacting them, but I like to group things together. And there are what I'll call the cultural economic issues. I always figured somebody was watching me at all times. It turns out demographics issues, which we've all heard a lot about, but actually are kind of unusual for us in the upper Midwest. And then there's the actions of our competitors, particularly University of Minnesota Twin Cities. We'll kind of touch on each of them. You know, I think the single biggest driver is not demographics. I think it is actually cultural and economic issues. You know, it's a great thing that the country is having this fantastic economic circumstance right now. Our unemployment numbers are really, really low, but historically, I think what we nationally in the threes percentage points for unemployment. That's great for the country. For higher ed enrollment, that tends to not be very good. Those two things tend to work opposite each other. And so there are students that are simply foregoing college right now because they can get good paying jobs in alternative areas quickly and easily now, so they don't, so they're foregoing the opportunity to go to college. Will that pay off for them down the road? We don't know. They don't know. But for the time being, it is impacting our enrollment numbers. The other thing that's going on is a cultural issue, which is I think there's some political leaders, some cultural leaders have indicated that maybe college isn't as important as it used to be. That leads over into whether or not they go straight to college or not, or whether they wait. There's also, you know, used to be you could go you'd spend some time finding yourself in college if you didn't know what you were going to do. Now there's more of a mantra: if you don't know, don't go. It's, you know, only go when you're actually knowing the target before you start. You know, so in order to be efficient and cost effective, you know, you go in with a goal in mind. You just don't go meandering through college. So unless you're ready to go, there's kind of an option to not go now. So I think those are the biggest drivers, economic and cultural issues, for my money, because demographics, as we'll go through, are actually favoring us right now. As we'll go through, we've all probably, most of us have heard about the 2025, 2026 drop-off, but until that time, for us here, we don't live in a bubble, but for us here in the upper Midwest, the demographics are not terrible. I could have rearranged this graph so it was bigger, but you'll see why I just kept it at the bottom in a minute. That's the number of high school graduates projected in North Dakota. The first number is this last year, 1819, going out to a projection of 3132. Obviously, the farther you go out, the more speculative the numbers get. But that's our expected growth. It's upward trending. It's a good, good to always have an upward trend. The number is really small. If we get 10% of the number of students that come out every year, which is about roughly how much NDSU gets, that's a nice number, but it's not going to be a huge overall number towards our enrollment, just based upon that increase. Oops, wrong way. That puts in perspective, that is the number of high school graduates coming out of Minnesota every year on the same scale over the same years. You can see why Minnesota's a lot more target-rich environment for students. It's just the numbers are so much bigger than ours. What's interesting, when we hear about the 25-26 drop-off, that's right there. And yeah, it drops off and it has a pretty good drop for a couple of years, but it bottoms out right there. And we're way over here. So we're about to start a run-up in Minnesota as far as high school graduates. So demographically speaking, we're in a pretty good spot. And even after the drop-off in Minnesota, I would point out that the floor is actually higher than we're at right now. And North Dakota continues to be higher the whole time. So these aren't terrible numbers from a demographics point of view. And I don't think that that's necessarily the primary driver for our issues right now. Now, we also don't live in a bubble, as I pointed out. Other states around these states don't have those good demographics. So they start poaching off of those states. And the whole market gets more competitive because if we could just carve off Minnesota and North Dakota to ourselves, it'd be fantastic. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. Here is a wider group. This is for the whole Midwest as defined by WICHE. So those are all the states up there that are in the Midwest. We're in the West, Minnesota's in the Midwest for these breakouts. And you can see the 2025-2026 break is much more significant for those states. And it ends up, when it hits the floor is well below where we are right now. So these other states are going to be, obviously, Minnesota's on the positive end of that, so the other states must be actually pushing even further down on some of those. And that's going to put more competitive pressure for those other states to try and grab Minnesota's students. And that'll impact our ability to grab those Minnesota students. This is for the West. And once again, that's where the drop-off occurs. And that floor is below where we're at now. So those demographics are not good for the West. So that's why I say it's a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to demographics. Good for us regionally, but we're not isolated enough to be able to not be immune from other areas' problems. The third issue is University of Minnesota. Our main competitor, particularly Twin Cities in Minnesota. A few years ago, they tried to increase their enrollment, but the Twin Cities has maintained largely a stable enrollment for the first-year class. But it appears that they're trying to grab more Minnesota students and fewer out-of-state students. That means if they're replacing out-of-state students with Minnesota students, we are probably one of the. If you go to the University of Minnesota, they have their admission plan, their 5-year plan from 18 to 23 online. We're one of the schools that is actually one of their competitors for students that apply to both schools. We're on their list of places that they come. So if they're taking more Minnesota students, that probably is some Minnesota students that would have come here if they hadn't gone to Twin Cities. So, in Minnesota, Twin Cities is such a big school that they themselves can impact us more so than any other individual school around the area. So their strategic decisions will impact us ourselves. So that's also a factor. Like I said, there's no single factor, but there's a combination of things going on. What does this lead to? This leads to all sorts of states trying to figure out what to do to get their more students in the door. This is from earlier or last year now. South Dakota started offering kind of in-state tuition to a bunch of states around them. This was also from that time period from last year. K-State to offer lower tuition for out-of-state students from 5 states. South Dakota, this is a screenshot of some social media that South Dakota was doing, reaching out to North Dakota students to let them know about the lower tuition in South Dakota. This is a Mayville State Mania. They, just anything to do to grab students to get them in the door, grab their name, get an application. It's going to become a lot more wild westish on the commercial side as we try and do things to reach out to students. And before I turn it over to Laura, I just wanted to give kind of a big national picture, but I also want to kind of leave you with some things that will be helpful for you to understand as Laura goes through what we're doing internally. And I was kind of in the same position that many of you find yourselves in. I was a little bit of an outsider at the admissions game when I started this, so I got this kind of quick crash course in admissions. And one of the first things they taught me was the funnel. And I look at it from a process point of view. So this is kind of the worldview of prospective students. Up here would be like all prospective students, and then they gradually get narrowed down till matriculation. And why I think that this is useful is that this kind of breaks out for me the roles and responsibilities on campus as far as who's doing what. Up here, I think of this as more marketing because we don't have a lot of information about the students. You know, this is anything from a billboard to a mass name buy, things along those lines that you have to be as broad as possible in your outreach, trying to grab them all because you don't know what's attractive to that one particular student. So you have to be kind of that's the marketing is about outreach and awareness. So that's kind of the institutional relations piece of this thing, where we generate applications. Once the applications are in, there's really kind of a baton handoff, although it's not. They both have responsibilities in each area, but there's kind of a baton handoff to our folks in admissions and financial aid. This is what we talked, when the president sent his email out a week ago, we talked about yield, that we're concentrating on our yield effort. The applications we're going to get largely, I mean, they're still coming in, they'll come into the summer, but the bulk of them are in. This is where we concentrate now on yield. That's everything from making sure that they feel that they're individually appreciated, financial aid numbers, you know, all sorts of things that go into making sure that every applicant we can get that comes to the university will come to the university. And Laura will talk more about that. The other thing that I keep in my head, and this is Chris's 4 Ps. This is literally found nowhere. It turns out that there's actually a marketing thing for 4 Ps, which I did not know when I developed my 4 Ps. So there's absolutely no copyright or trademark infringement going on. But these are the things that I think of when the kind of the literature and our experience shows that these are the 4 big categories for what college students will that we can impact for the college choice process. The first one is proximity. Realistically, unless you're Stanford or Harvard, you've got a radius around which you're going to draw your students. It's a couple hundred miles. And so we have Fargo. Fargo is a fantastic, vibrant, growing city. And that is a real ace in the hole when it comes to our admission process. On the other hand, it's, I don't know if you noticed, but it's not a very highly densely populated area around us. You know, this isn't the Northeast or California or Florida where there's, you know, millions of people. So we have a fairly low density population to draw from. So that's both a good and a bad being in Fargo for us. Positive experience in my mind is everything that student feels about the campus. Did mom or dad go here? Did an older sibling go here? Did the person in high school that they liked, did they come here? Do they like the football team? When they came for the tour, was the parking lot clean? And were they able to find a spot? Was the bathroom clean? Did they like the food? Did the tour go well? Do they read good things about us in the media? Do they have good faculty interactions? The students that they know who came here, did they have every one of us that work at this university have a part to play in that positive experience, making sure that our students have a good positive thing, that they will go back to their hometowns and relay that they love NDSU. So that's the positive experience, and I can't say more about how important that is. The next thing is price, and that's you know, we're seeing more and more price sensitivity. Students becoming much more savvy about their price. There's only so many places we can either cut, we can get more scholarships, we can get more direct student aid, and we're trying to do all those things. but pricing is going to become more and more important, and finding that right price point is tough, where you're not undercharging for a valuable service, but at the same time, you're attracting as many students as you can. And the last one is program availability. Are we at where the students need us to be from a program point of view? And that is both the type of programs, the delivery methods. Do we need to be moving more online with full programs? Do we need to be serving our non-traditionally aged student populations better? The answer to both those questions is yes, by the way. But we need to be thinking about how we get that done. And the admissions folk can't influence that piece of the puzzle. That has to come from academic affairs. That has to come from, that's a much bigger, more holistic question that hopefully the strategic planning process will provide us some guidance on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Thank you. I'm going to cruise through some slides that have some statistics and things on them. All of this is publicly available on the NDSU website, and it'll be available in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to dwell on much of this at all. But the point, so Chris showed this slide at the beginning, and the point I want to make is the yellow line, I think, is equally as important as the green line. So the green line is overall enrollment those years, but that yellow line is how many students were actually graduating. And so we are graduating more students, both in number and in percentage, and I'll show you the percentage later. And that's a wonderful thing. We're now above our peers in terms of four-year graduation rates. That's a huge accomplishment that we've all worked toward for years. But it also means fewer students paying tuition every semester, realistically. That is a piece of the puzzle. This just breaks it down by overall new students, new graduate students, new transfers, and new freshmen. I do want to point out, I'm going to show some slides with just international students in just a few minutes, but whenever you see overall enrollment numbers, they would include all international students. They're folded in here because international students are also a grad student, they're also an undergraduate, whatever. Just want to make sure you have that point. So again, I won't dwell on this slide, but the one point I want to make is back in 08, I did leave that on. This is a 10-year look back, but I went one more year because 08 was our largest first-year class. And the biggest question people have is why. I wish I had the answer to that question. We did all the same things that year that we did the next year and the year prior to it. So sometimes the chips fall, but that's where you think about the larger context. That year was the Great Recession in the country, and that hit other states greater than it did North Dakota because we were in an oil boom at that time. We actually didn't have any state budget concerns at that time. So perhaps we attracted more Minnesota students who were concerned about the economy. Not sure. Then we have this other peak year in 2017, and in between there, I think those of us who have been around the university for 20 or more years, we have this perception that it's been a steep uphill climb. And that steep uphill climb came in the early 2000s. These years have been relatively stable, a little growth, a little decline, a little up and down. And so it's like our perception versus our reality. So we had that peak year in 2017, which was, again, what was going on. That was the year we took the 17% budget cut, and the oil revenue was crashing in the state. So did that news impact students' decisions? Again, not sure. But then the next year followed by the decline, which was experienced, as Chris pointed out, regionally to a heavy extent as well as nationally. This just shows, again, our international population and how that makes, what mix that makes up. And the gray bar is the non-degree seeking students. The green bar is the transfer students, and the yellow bar is new first-year students. So again, that pretty steady decline there, and lots of things impact domestic undergraduate enrollment. Lots of things impact international student enrollment as well. I have a couple of slides that Alicia from International Programs Office helped us with, and we can talk more specifically about that later if you're interested in delving more deeply into that. This is then the overall international student enrollment broken down by undergraduate and professional, which is just that tiny little green bar in the middle, and then graduate students. And then that green bar on the top, this is a little confusing because I've got this scale is for overall students. I wanted to show sort of the percentage of international students to overall enrollment. So the scale is a little bit misleading, but just kind of helps you get a perspective. So we've gone from about 6% international enrollment to about 5% of the whole. And I think at our peak with international, we were maybe around 7 or 8. Anyway, so that definitely has been a steady decline. And some of you may remember we had a lot of intensive efforts going on back in those 08, 09 years with an institution in India. We had a full-time Vice-Provost focusing on that. It costs a lot. It costs a lot and it's more complicated to recruit international students. But they're an important part of our mix as well. And so we're definitely, as Chris said, all of the strategies are on the table again. And that's, I think, the really good and promising piece to the future is that I think we're understanding that all of the various pieces that make up the enrollment puzzle are equally important. This one, again, just is a different way to look at overall enrollment breakdown by undergraduate, graduate, and professional. And then people are often curious about the makeup. Again, why so concerned about Minnesota? Because it's 40, it's over, well, it's 40, it's a larger percentage than our North Dakota students. And so with the freshman class, that's even a greater percentage because some of the Minnesota students who come end up getting residency in second, third, and fourth years. So again, it's a big piece of the overall puzzle. And then the great news, these are the graduation rates. Again, we've gone from 25%, which is under our peers, to 41% in a relatively short time period. And did some fun work this summer with Emily Berg and Jill Machenbacher and Rhonda Kitch to delve into why we think that is the case. And we came up with a lot of factors that, again, it's never one thing, but we've increased the percentage of students taking 15 or more credits pretty drastically per semester. We've reduced DFW courses and some gateway courses. We've got a focus on pedagogy training and some national grants that we have. We've got the advising platform, the Navigate platform, and then just a whole lot of programs in both student affairs and academic affairs where we're really working together to work on that student experience, that part that Chris talked about that we could control. So this is really a fact we're celebrating, and this is proof of the positive experience that we can be putting out there back in front. This again is just another reiteration of the funnel, and the thing I mostly wanted to point out here is I actually think this funnel should be flipped and it should be a pyramid because it makes it seem like the students just come in and they just fall down to the enrollment. And really there's a whole lot of heavy lifting at every stage by this team right here. And the funnel I don't think works exactly the same for international students, but might even be narrower. So that team as well in the second row and throughout whoever the staff from International and Study Abroad Services. So just a lot of effort at every stage. And I think most people would be surprised at the level of sophistication of the efforts at each stage of the funnel. People talk about yield rates a lot. This slide, again, publicly available on our website, on institutional research website. The green bar is the applicants, the yellow bar is the admitted students. And so our percentage of admitted students has really not changed a whole lot over time. And then the gray bar is those who come. But what really has changed and what's impacting us is again, the scale for this neon green line is right here. So this is the percentage. So if you take the percentage of admits to enrolled, that's what we call our yield rate. And so you can see what's happening. We historically had a really high yield rate. We yielded almost 50%, over 50% of the students who applied and were admitted. And nationally, yield rates are dropping. And again, that was a real discussion in the admission world years before it hit us. We were just sort of insulated from that for a long time. And then I think because of these cultural and economic drivers that Chris talked about, we are now seeing those yield rate falls. And so that's where efforts come in to different strategies to try to address those. The top 10 reasons for attending SU hasn't changed much over the time we've been working in this field. So these are surveys of students who come. And so they're great. They're coming because of our programs and our tuition and the right size. And these things change order a little bit, but the list doesn't change a whole lot. Regional market conditions, I think we talked about this quite a bit already. I just want to point out two things toward the bottom of this slide. Is that Minnesota has a need-based grant that is between $2,500 and $8,000. And so students, if they stay and go to school in the state, yes, the U of M may be more expensive, but they've got this need-based grant, and they come over here, they leave that money on the table. And I think as our costs have increased and our aid hasn't, that gap has become narrower. North Dakota puts in about 500 to 2,000 per students for our in-state. So we're actually doing pretty well with our yield of in-state students. It's that Minnesota, and then the U of M factor, which we already talked about. This just gives an example of the proportion of a student getting a presidential scholarship, which is $3,000 a year for 4 years. Back in '09, that paid 32% of their overall cost, and today it pays 19% of their overall cost. So we're losing ground a little bit, and lots of great efforts going on with our friends at the foundation. Phenomenal work raising funds, but donors want to give to specific things. They don't want to give a broad-based scholarship for recruitment for just give to any student. So and some of that fundraising takes time to actually bring results. So making great strides there, but a lot of catch up to do. So these were the actions that we told you about last year when we presented that we had put in place to hope to try and increase this fall's enrollment. We believe that many of these were effective in helping us maintain because our decline this fall from last fall to this fall was much less dramatic than the previous year. So I'm not going to dwell on those, but these are new tactics that are in place for next year. One of the most exciting things that will impact both undergrad, graduate, and international enrollment is a new CRM, which has allowed us to have a mobile-friendly app. Prior to this fall, we were on the university system application, which was not mobile-friendly, and as you know, students want to do everything on their phones. So that huge lift for the admission team, particularly Adam and Keith and folks in international and graduate school as well in implementing this program. We did an application fee waiver, as you know, so that it's free to apply here. I don't know how application fees ever developed, but if that's an impediment to a student applying, we want to take that barrier away. We are seeing some promising applications for this fall. They're up. We're not counting our chickens before they're hatched, but certainly if a lot of these students may not have applied without that waiver, and once they apply, we could build that relationship with them. And so we feel good about that. Been lots of other work with creating transfer guides for schools in Minnesota and North Dakota, and we're also experimenting with some need-based aid in particular bands where we're not yielding well for students that have a particular unmet need. And then I skipped over expanding our outreach into Wisconsin and Illinois. And again, everybody else is doing the same thing, but those two states are showing some promise. So that's exciting to see. This just, again, reiterates where our primary and secondary markets are. Our top competitors, I don't think many would be too surprised about these. So our North Dakota students, these are the other institutions that they consider or attend if they don't decide not to come here. And then for our Minnesota students, so we're competing both in and out of state. But for North Dakota, I think still pretty well on top of that game, as we do receive about 10% of the North Dakota high school graduates, more than any other state institution. This just gives a level of activity for the undergrad admission office. I'm sure it's not a whole lot. It looks different in the international office, but there's just lots going on. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but to let you know that we're out there at college fairs, we're driving the state and neighboring states, and these snow days, we're canceling visits on those days, and we're taking care that counselors are safe wherever they are in the hinterlands. And so just a lot of activity, handwritten notes, the number of Saturdays that these folks are on campus greeting our students. So just want to recognize that it just takes, that's what's involved with the funnel. They don't just drop through there. And in international, so I'm not an expert in this area by any means. Alicia Kaufman helped me with these slides, but we're seeing changing markets there as well. So increased competition from Australia, Canada, and the UK. So while international populations in the US have been declining, these other countries are capitalizing on that and growing. There's political perceptions, and this is really interesting data that Alicia's tried to educate me about over the last year or two, in that I think there is a perception that the political environment is not friendly to international students at this time, and there's probably some reality to that. But what the data that she's finding is that there's been an overall decrease since 2015, but that is looking more positive since 2018. And so some of it is just the perception in these other countries going after the students who would have more naturally defaulted to us, is how I'm understanding this. But there's some opportunities. India, Vietnam, and Malaysia show some promise in terms of their fast-growing middle classes, and they're similar to undergraduates in the office, showing some increased application activity for this fall. So again, we don't count them until they come, but it's looking promising. And so new tactics from this area as well. Again, moving the international admission over there. And for those of you who've been around campus for a while, it was always there for many years historically at NDSU. It got moved to the Office of Admission for, 3-4 years. And this is not a statement on anybody's competency. This is a statement on focusing in on maybe a specialized area that requires a bit more a one-stop shop approach. And so that's what we're back to, is what we always had at this university previously. So some things, when you're here long enough, like nothing's really all that new. You just recycle it. So the new CRM and online application impacts this population as well. Transfer, there's some new partnerships on the horizon for both transfer students and some plus partnerships. And then some tweaking of the international student scholarships. And then, where appropriate, faculty and staff coordinating to do some recruiting while they're traveling. So again, some renewed focus in this area as well. Last slide is how can you help that student experience? If we can provide that positive experience, if we can get them on campus. So we need your help. If you're faculty, those campus visits are extremely important. Greeting the tours when you see them, informing the International Student and Study Abroad Services Office if you're doing foreign travel so that you can help, putting your best foot forward, meeting scholarship deadlines, all of these things. Do what these two offices ask you to do. That's really what I would ask. And then, we really do need to be, so we talked a lot, again, we're still talking about sort of short-term tactics, but the longer-term strategies are also being worked on alongside this. What can we be doing with dual credit so as not to necessarily allow high school teachers to teach our courses, but so that we're actually teaching classes in the high school? What can we be doing with non-traditional students? We have a task force working on that right now in terms of students who have some college but no degree. There's some opportunity there. How can we rebrand our programs that might just need a fancier name, or they may need to seem more approachable to our students? How can we remarket what we're already good at? And those, again, as Chris mentioned, are things that we really need our academic affairs partners to be working at. So that was a lot in a short time. So we've allowed about 15 minutes for questions. We've got links we'd like to bring out to you, so our folks from online and
I'll make a blanket statement. You have to hold it about 12 inches or so away from your mouth because it's pretty loud. So
And Chris or I will take questions. We have experts here from the international office as well as admission. So.
And the 30-30 rule.
30-30, so you can hear me. First of all, kudos to the enrollment team and the international team. I know you guys are working hard, and from what I saw from President Brashani's comments, we're heading in the right direction. So, and it was great to see the retention piece up there. Faculty and staff, we should all be proud of the graduation rates here. My question is about program availability, and you touched on it a little bit, Chris, but there's colleges out there like Southern New Hampshire, St. Leo, even Purdue purchasing a college for online. Most of, especially in the graduate level, the students want flexibility. What's on the horizon for online programs at NDSU?
This one's on.
You can start. If I don't like your answer, then I'll jump in.
Absolutely, totally normal. So John's question is really good. We've been seen as, at NDSU, as largely serving the traditional student population in a traditional format, live student in class, in person. And that's where our numbers are at. It's funny, when you look at across the system numbers that are provided by the system, we are at the bottom, 5 or 6% of our wholly online classes, programs, so students who's wholly enrolled online. We're second to highest, I think only Williston beats us, with the number of hybrid students. So we have a lot of students here who have incorporated online classwork and coursework into their overall program. It's not a fully online program. And we need to start thinking about, do we need to wrap some of those programs up wholly online? What is the best way to serve our state's needs? And I think there's a big question mark when you mention Southern New Hampshire and Arizona State and Purdue's acquisition of Kaplan. How are people going to see the online environment from a college choice perspective? I don't know. It's a $64,000 question, or $64 trillion probably actually. If you're sitting there for the traditional age student, the online education doesn't work particularly well. It doesn't have good retention rates, doesn't have good success rates. For the non-traditional age population, it is very effective because of the flexibility. You got a commitment to graduate on time. You need flexibility because of family and work already is got a lot of time. So, and my wife is going back to school full time. I use my wife as an example in this thing. It's worked wonderfully for her. But when she wanted to go back to school online, she first looked to her local university. And I'm willing to bet that the bulk of people that are going to be going back to school or need to go back for a second degree or finish a degree are probably going to be looking locally rather than to the big nationals. And that seems to be shaking out. That seems to be what the market's indicating, is that as we, for returning students, I think of it, and I am a former banking guy, the big national banks versus the community banks. There's always going to be a market there for your community bank, for your local university to fill that niche. I think that a lot of people, if given the option, would rather go to the local school and take advantage of the local institution than to go to the Arizona States and the Southern New Hampshires. How that'll play out, that's just pure speculation. It seems to be leaning that way, but that will be one of the big questions over the next decade of higher education. How many students do those large online programs lead away from traditional institutions? I don't think it'll be as much, but we'll see.
Left side near the top.
Hi. I'm just wondering, there never seems to be a focus on growing the graduate population. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or whose responsibility you think that is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Our efforts the last couple of years have been aimed at undergraduate population, simply because that's honestly the kind of the easier one to control for. Graduate populations are a lot tougher because the decision-making is diffuse across different areas. It's at the colleges, it's at the graduate school. It also costs more because you have to have money for the research assistantships and the teaching assistantships and those things. It gets to be a lot more complicated. And honestly, when 2018 hit, do we want more graduate students? Absolutely. It's easier to fix at the undergraduate level first, and that was where the fire was at, so to speak. But as hopefully after we stabilize and start growing again, fingers crossed, at the undergraduate population, that will certainly be on the, it's always on the table, but it's more of a focus, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with what Chris said. And in terms of who's responsible, I mean, I think that we all are, but I do think that it's more academically driven. The faculty and the programs need to be very invested in those programs. I think there is a lot of growth opportunity for professional master's programs, if that's where our institution wants to go. But again, that's where, like Chris said, it's really tied in with the curriculum, and the faculty control that. And so where do they see their efforts being most productive?
Hi. I'm curious with, Chris, you mentioned the trend of the question nationally being if the four-year college degree or a four-year degree or an undergraduate degree has as much value. And one of the things I've been noticing, especially in conversations on social media, is the challenge that debt isn't worth it. And I know, like with Dave Ramsey and a lot of, especially our Minnesota parents, maybe have experienced the recession personally with foreclosures or other situations with the recession. How are we addressing that conversation around financing with debt and that being valuable, kind of the same way we're talking about the value of a degree in general?
Yeah, that is something we are actually honestly not all that experienced with, because we've typically been such a low-cost option that we haven't had to. So that's definitely something this enrollment group has talked lots about. It has some legs in marketing, but lots of legs in the admission arena as well as the financial aid arena. And I say a couple things about it. One, there's a lot of public perception around debt because the ROI is still there. And NDSU has, and say I should have this on the tip of my tongue, but we do still, for students over 20 years, their investment is paid back very, very quickly. We have a very low default rate, one of the lowest in the country. So like overall, the statistics bear out that a degree from here is still worth it. We have to get better about talking about those statistics. The other thing is we've got lots of jobs, and 40% of those Minnesota students that come to school here will stay here for their first job. So those are some of the other values. At the same time, looking at my colleague in financial aid, the gap in terms of what financial aid will pay and what students, what the cost is getting larger. And that is a piece of what we're battling against, and people's willingness to take on debt and their perception about debt is a concern. I don't have any easy answers for that. I'm really curious to see what will happen if we get a Democratic administration, because all of them are promising debt relief or free college or whatever. Interesting presentation I went to at APLU last year was about, most of the people defaulting on their debt in the US. Like, I'm actually not a fan of these plans that pay off debt for everybody, because most people will pay off their student loans and get a good return on them. But she was talking about most of the people defaulting are doctors and lawyers, and they do have an ability to pay over time. And so if you just wipe out debt for everybody, but anyway, now I'm on a soapbox. But that was my personal opinion, not NDSU's. Anyway, it's something we have to continue to talk about. Not easy.
To continue on the free college thing, with the growing popularity of, especially among young people, about free public universities, what do you think that could mean for NDSU if in the next couple of years free public college is a reality?
It's a fascinating thing to talk about right now, and actually, this is my personal belief, not NDSU's also, and it's interesting to think about, like, over the course of the last century, going as far as 6th grade at the beginning of the 1900s was on average, at the middle to the end of the century. Your secondary degree was fully funded by the state. It was also, that became the norm. And now, like, are we seeing a political push to better align educational and funded, kind of publicly funded educational attainment with the state's need for an educated population? Has it gone beyond the 12th grade at this point? Where does that shake out? We have the foggiest idea. I mean, it's kind of hard to say where NDSU will be in it until we know how it shakes out. Will it simply be greater Pell Grants? Will it be, everybody gets free college? We don't know. It's theoretical. Right now, the concept is purely theoretical. The actual, like, who's paying? Does the state pay the institution? Does the state pay the individual? None of those details have been worked out yet. And so, it's kind of premature to say how it would impact NDSU until we actually have a solid policy to react to.
Just one announcement. We're going to go to the Zoom viewers after this next question from Mark. So Daniel, if you have any, let us know, but we're going to have Mark first and then we'll go to the next one online.
So is there any evidence that the reduction in state funding in higher education in North Dakota, particularly at NDSU, has contributed to student enrollment decline?
I don't have any causal evidence, but everybody reads the same headlines, and so certainly could be a contributing factor.
Dan, do you have anybody that has a question? If not, I have one.
Currently, I don't see anybody who is either raising their hand virtually or typing anything, so I think you've done it.
Okay, and we'll have about one after this one. Are you tracking time from when a prospective student applies till they're accepted? And is there any kind of relationship between quicker acceptance and them enrolling?
We got an expert here.
And will the new tool help us?
Sure. So actually, part of our efforts the last couple of years have been about getting a response out to students more quickly. Research shows that the earlier you get your offer out to a student, the higher likelihood that they'll enroll with you rather than somebody that takes longer to get a response to them. So moving to a new application tool and also employing some other methods to let students self-report their academic criteria have allowed us to turn around decisions much more quickly than we had in the past. So average time we saw last year cut down by several days. Right now, on average, we can turn around an admission decision when we have manageable numbers coming in about 4 days. So not requiring students to submit all their criteria up front, but self-report and then report to us with official criteria or transcripts at the end definitely makes a big difference for us. That's something we moved to 2 years ago, as well as the new applications being more efficient has also allowed us to do that. There are times of the year, though, when it's like a flood. It's not possible, it's not humanly possible for the staff that we have to turn around those applications in 4 days. When you get 800 applications in 1 week, you still have to touch every single one of those. So there are times of year that it takes a little bit longer for us to turn those around, but institutional research helped us out a couple of years ago, and on average, when we look at the entire year, decisions take about 7 days.
I think I'm going to, if I can, piggyback on that from the international office perspective. So I do work in recruitment and admission with the in the International Student Study Abroad Services office. And for international applicants, particularly undergrad, it's different in the grad world. It really does, speed does matter, because in addition to being accepted, they're also waiting for that immigration document. And there have been a lot of studies and anecdotal studies as well, I guess you could call them, where whichever I-20 or DS-2019 document a student gets first, they're often prone to choosing that school. My question quickly is back to one of the slides, and stop me if I misinterpreted. It looks like applications are holding steady or even increasing, but then yield has been sharply decreasing. And it makes sense to me that the yield would be lower because, to a certain extent, because, you know, if you've got a higher number of applications, you're probably not going to yield, your yields may be higher, but not in proportion to the number, to the increase in apps. But what's the rest of that story? Is part of it, are we creating a monster across the US where, because it's so easy to apply, people are applying to a gazillion colleges? And I'll stop there.
No, I think you did observe the slide correctly. And yes, it's becoming an arms race. And so there is a bit of that. I mean, yield has been declining nationally. And yeah, so if we got 20,000 apps, would our class be larger, or would we just be working harder? That's an unanswered question, but something we think a lot about. And the competitiveness for those applications is, as people drop application fees and do various things, what do those applications really mean, if anything? So I don't have any answers, Lisa, but I think your observation is right on.
20,000 apps though, good.
I don't know.
Yep. I just wanted to add to my comments about turning around applications really quickly. And Laura had a slide at the very end, like, how can you help us? And a lot of what we've talked about addresses freshman enrollment, and sometimes we forget about our transfer students, and it's a really important population to us. And probably the key factor for those students is turning around an evaluation and advising for them. So if you are a faculty member who advises students and a transfer student is reaching out to you, how quickly you get back to them about their evaluation and registration has a direct impact on whether or not they will enroll. So that's another factor that comes into play with timing.
I want to thank all of you for joining us today here in person and online. Again, the next one is March 25th, right back here, 12 o'clock noon. We'll be covering NDSU marketing. And please, again, thank our speakers today.